Hello, we are privileged today to have with us Reverend Dr. Maureen Hoyt, longtime minister in the Science of Mind religion. So we are here and she's going to tell us about her life and share with us for this Wise Sage project. So thank you very much for being with us, Maureen. And I'm going to just start off and ask you about how your life started, where it started, and how you found Science of Mind.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Marilyn, for asking me to participate. I appreciate it so much, and to be called a wise sage is pleasure enough. All the rest of it is almost incidental after that. I started out being raised Roman Catholic, very, very staunch Roman Catholic, French-Canadian Roman Catholic, as a matter of fact. And my family, I was raised in Canada up until I was 16 years old. I'm from Kimberley, British Columbia. And I've, even as a youngster, I was a seeker. I was always looking. And my oldest sister went to the convent when she was 16 years old, and they sent her back home because she had embarked upon the Sisters of Charity, which is a missionary group of nuns, and she ended up getting tetanus from an injury and did not recover very well. And so they sent her home and they kept the dowry. And as my dad said, when I said I wanted to be a nun, he said, "Over my dead body," is what he said. And I never could understand why women couldn't be priests. I didn't have a very good experience with the nuns growing up. Most of them were harsh disciplinarians, as was the habit, no pun intended, in those days. And except for Sister Jacinta, when she came along, she was a 23-year-old, and she embraced us as no other nun had done before, or that I know of since. My family is riddled with people in ministry. My dad was one of 14 children, and my mom one of 8 children. And in my dad's family, his 2 youngest siblings, a boy and a girl, Edward and Cecile. Edward became a priest and Cecile became a nun. So after I got out on my own, when we emigrated to the United States and moved to California, and I got out on my own, I started looking. I started seeking. And in 1968, I know exactly when it was, I saw Neville Goddard at the Scottish Rite Temple on California Street in San Francisco. I cried through the whole thing. And I said, if there were a church like that, I would belong to that church. So fast forward to 1973, I moved to Southern California and married my husband. And in 1973, my uncle Edward, who was a teacher, he'd left the priesthood in 1962. And my grandmother, who was so humiliated by his leaving the priesthood, she told all her family and relatives and friends that he had died. It was preferable for him to have died than to have left the priesthood, and it was just shameful. So in 1973, I was the only one of our family who lived in Southern California. And Uncle Edward was killed in a freak accident out on the desert. And so I was relegated the task to go to the church where his memorial service was in Downey. And when I got into the church, I thought, this is unusual. This is not like any funeral I have ever been to before. And I was quite enamored with the people and with the message and with everything. And so when Bill and I married and we moved out to Agora, one of my friends who was in our Lamaze class was a religious scientist. She and her husband were married by Frank Richelieu. And we would talk and talk and talk philosophically. And she said, you know, Maureen, she said, you're like already a religious scientist and you don't even know it. And so she suggested that I go to the Thousand Oaks Church. And I went there, and that was the days of Dr. Bill Lowe. Do you remember him? Anyway, everybody there was old. It was like 15 people in the center, and they were all old. Well, fast forward to a year and a half later, when Reverend David Lawfrey and Reverend Barbara Lawfrey came there, and Susan said, come on back, come and try this out. They're young, they're vibrant, and see what happens. So at that point, the rest is kind of history. My daughter at that point was 4, and she was asking questions about God and about sin, because a friend of ours had taken her to a Baptist Bible school for the summer, just before she went into first grade, to kindergarten. And she came home and she slammed the front door and she stood in the entryway and she said, Mom, did you know I'm a sinner? And like it was some sort of qualification of some kind. And that was the moment at which I thought, oh, we have to go back to the science of mind. This isn't going to work for me. So we did that, and we've never looked back. And both my children, my son is 5 years younger, they were raised in the science of mind. And I had my first Asilomar experience actually my first real, honest to goodness, religious science experience was when a Weight Watcher lecturer I had in Pasadena in 1973, 74. She would give us the most uplifting lecture. She never talked about food or recipes or anything. She talked about the power of choice. She talked about how we could choose to change our lives. And I would cry through almost every Weight Watcher lecture. And finally, one time I stayed back and she asked me an interesting question. She said, are you churched? And I thought, what does that mean? She said, no, do you have a church affiliation? And I said, no, but I said, I'm very spiritual. And she said, well, then I have something for you. She said, would you like to come to church with me on Sunday? My husband, when he found out I was going to Church of Religious Science, he thought for sure I was going to a cult of some kind. And he made me take my own car. But she took me to Founders. William Hornaday standing up in that crow's nest at Founders. And that Sunday, Dr. McNeil had the entire 100-person choir with their blue robes and their red collars. And I just thought, I have died and gone to heaven. And honestly, when they took me back and had me meet Dr. Hornaday in his office, I felt like I touched the hand of God. And so that started my journey. And my first Asilomar experience was in 1984. And I went every year to Asilomar, sometimes both United Asilomar and RSI's Asilomar, because RSI's was in May, United's was in August. And so that would be 2 times a year when I could get out of the cage of motherhood and go and get replenished a little bit. So that's kind of what my history was in the teaching. You're muted, Marilyn.
So who was your teacher when you started taking classwork, and about when was that? And how did you decide to become a minister?
Well, I first started taking classes in 1984. I probably took Science of Mind 100 6 times. Kept going back because I just, I fancy myself as a quick study, but it was just something that I knew that it was a shift in consciousness, and I would just get so far, and then it was like there was pushback, you know.
Mhm.
This really be, because that Catholic indoctrination is so strong. You can take the girl out of the Catholic, but you can't take the Catholic out of the girl, I think, sometimes. And so David and Barbara Lawfrey were my first teachers in the science of mind. And I went through 100 and 200 with David and Barbara over and over again. And I was always the registrar. I was very involved with the center on a volunteer level. I did all kinds of things for them.
Mhm.
I decided to become a practitioner. And I mean, no disrespect when I say this, but David Lawfrey would not sign the letter that I needed to take practitioner training with Dennis Merritt Jones, because he said he was going to teach practitioner training in 2 years, and in his estimation, I wasn't ready to be a practitioner. And he was not, let me just say this, he was not the kindest person in the world. And he refused to sign my paper. And I knew I was ready to be a practitioner. This was 1988. And so I said to him, I said, well, he said, I'm not signing your letter. And he said, you have to wait until I teach the class. And I said, no. I said, I really think I'm ready to do this now. And he said, no, you're not. I said, yes, I am. And ended up having this rather heated discussion. And he said, well, I'm not signing the letter. And I said, well, then guess what? I resigned my membership at the center, and I'll become a member of the Simi Valley Center. And that set him off quite vehemently. And so I walked away from the Thousand Oaks Church that day. Interestingly enough, I had just received the Volunteer of the Year award at the center, and going to be having a banquet to honor me. And he told me that I couldn't really tell anybody else what had happened, and that this is the first time I've ever told anybody what happened, but that I needed to come to the banquet and receive my honor, and then that would be the end of it. I wouldn't have to do or see them anymore. So I left and I went over to Dennis Merritt Jones, and I took practitioner training with Dennis with 9 other students who are my dearest friends to this day. Those 9 other students. One of them has, or 2 of them have since passed away. But then the first 6 months I was in practitioner training, every time I had to get up and do a spiritual mind treatment, I was catatonic. So I ended up repeating prac training, which was probably one of the best things I could have done. And in 1991, I enrolled in ministerial studies with Dennis Merritt Jones, graduated in 1993, did the intensive and my oral panels at Asilomar in May of 1993. So as of this year, it's 25 years in ministry. So, excuse me. So that's the story.
That's great. Now, you have participated in many areas like education, and you were editor of the Creative Thought magazine for many years. Tell us about that and your involvements in different parts of the RSI and then CSL as they
Well, RSI, my first speaking assignment, I was telling my class on Wednesday night, that if the dream is only up to me, it's not big enough. And when I was in ministerial studies in 1991, after everybody had left the chapel, I went and stood behind the lectern because I love sermons by the sea, where Ernest Holmes spoke. And so I stood there, and I kid you not, I felt this presence beside me. as I stood at the lectern, and I said, you know what, someday I'm going to speak here in this chapel as a minister. And I made that declaration and set that intention. Well, fast forward to 1996, my first year after I took the Granada Hills Church of Religious Science. My speaking assignment was sandwiched between Dr. Carol Carnes and Dr. Arlene Bum in the chapel at Asilomar. It was like the bologna between two pieces of white bread. And it was just almost overwhelming, to have that, to see that dream come to fruition. And so how I started out was by 1990, I graduated in 93. So by 96, I guess it was 96, yes, I had my first ministerial studies class. And so we had created a curriculum, the ministerial studies curriculum, and Dr. David Walker, and I would teach other people how to present this material, how to teach the ministerial study program. And that's how I started out working with curriculum. I had volunteered on many different levels at Asilomar. And as you will remember, when you and Richard used to come to INTA meetings, I was there at every INTA meeting, the International New Thought Alliance in Los Angeles. So I was very involved in that as well.
And were you a minister in a pulpit at this time, or did you stay in Silicon Valley?
When I first started, I was a staff minister with Dennis Merritt Jones in Simi Valley. And he didn't really want to go to the INTA meetings, but he was a member of INTA. And so he sent me, which is how I ended up having this wonderful relationship with so many different guided ministers and independent New Thought ministers through INTA. So there was a broad spectrum of New Thought teachers that I got to participate with. As you'll remember, in those days, we met at the Glendale Church of Religious Science. And it was quite a wonderful experience. And then we moved the meetings to Granada Hills when I became president of INTA. And so yes, I've always been interested in curriculum. And I wrote many of the newer classes in the Science of Mind 200 series. The ones over or beyond number 213, the ones that have student guides with the teacher's manuals. And I edited and proofread, and also was responsible for monitoring the Science of Mind 200 curriculum, so that some of the classes never became a part of the curriculum, but somebody would teach a particular class which was congruent with the Science of Mind, but it never made it into the curriculum. So we had a thing that we called a variance for some of those classes, and they had a one-time approval to be able to present those as an elective in the 4 units in Science of Mind 200. So, and it's interesting, even to this day, some of the people come on the minister's listserv and they want to know, where's the student guides for anything under 200? Figure it out, 213, figure it out. You get to create it yourself if you want a guide. Yeah. It is how I approach it. But yes, very involved with the curriculum and on the Board of Education for Religious Science International. I was 8 years as the editorial coordinator for Creative Thought magazine, as you said. And then once they wanted me to come on to the Board of Education, I couldn't do both. It was just the Board of Education was 20 hours a week. It's time intensive, to do curriculum and be involved at that level. So they suggested that we turn the magazine over to somebody else, which ended up to be Reverend Dr. Cynthia Cavalcante.
Mhm.
And so she took it over from there. But I did still see the final draft of the magazine all the way up until, gosh, well, when Patrick Soren took it over, I still saw the final draft magazine before it went to print.
Okay. Great.
My history is of service in a big way, and I can tell you so many other things. I was on the committee for the first joint UCRS and RSI Asilomar that we had before the integration with wonderful people, Sean Kindorf and Molly Cameron, Guy Williams, Eddie Watkins was the music that year, music director, Sunshine Day. We had a wonderful committee when we did the joint Asilomar, and it was bringing the best practices of both our experiences into the joint conference for that year. And, you know, not just because I was on the team, but I think it was actually one of the best Asilomars we ever had. It was like, you know, a family reunion of sorts. For me, anyway, it was a family reunion. I loved it.
Yeah. Were you involved with other organizations such as Agent? You were involved with INTA locally in California there. Were you ever involved with Agent? Were you involved with the reunion, what they call it, the integration process?
I was involved somewhat with the integration process, but at that point in time, there was a bit of a snafu having to do with the education committee and the shift that they wanted to make as the Holmes Institute and not allowing for the regional ministerial studies programs. I graduated 27 ministers in the time that I did the ministerial studies program. Excuse me. Many of them are still in pulpit ministry to this day or active in some form or another. I was involved and have been involved for probably 30 years with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I have re-energized my involvement with them since leaving the pulpit 2 years ago. And we have a wonderful consciousness cruise that's happening in October where I'll be a presenter for them. And, you know, one of the difficulties with the Institute of Noetic Sciences is I stepped away for a significant period of time because instead of trying to spiritualize the intellect, they were trying to intellectualize spirit. And it didn't fit with my Ernest Holmes model. Didn't fit with Tord. It didn't fit with Raymond Charles Barker. It didn't fit with what I grew up with in our teaching. But that's had a major shift, and they're sort of, it's less science and more spirituality. And so I find myself intrigued by some of the work that they're offering right now as well.
Okay. What impact do you believe science of mind, religious science will have on the world, or has on the world at the present time and in the future?
Well, I'm teaching a class right now at Granada Hills. That was my home church for 14 and a half years. I brought my license back to Granada Hills as I am a minister emeritus from there. And what I've discovered in this particular class, it started Wednesday night. There are about between 35 and 40 people in the class. And these are the age range is significant because there are some really young adults, 20, 30 somethings in the class. And I think a couple of the older members are in their 70s, in their early 70s. I forget that I am too. You know, I forget that I'm as old as some of the older people that are in my class. But what I'm discovering is that there's a whole generation who are still looking for the magic pill, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And the younger generation seem to get it very quickly that there's no magic pill unless I do the work. And so they are there in class kind of to prime the pump for some of the other people there. One of my very, very first classes I had at Granada Hills when I was first starting out as a first year class was almost all Hispanic students from the barrio in San Fernando. And these kids, I kid you not, I kept track of them over the years, 25 years later. These are all successful, prospering adults through the power of positive thinking. Not one of them, they're all magnificent human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And, these kids would sit around and discuss philosophically the science of mind and how to use this in their life, and then take it out into the world, because it's useless if we keep it for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Have to be able to share it with people. And it doesn't matter what religion the people are, you know, it's a teaching that's for everybody. And so I see more and more people gravitating, for instance, to the Oprah Winfrey, Deepak Chopra meditations, and the conversations that they have with the meditations having to do with everything that Ernest Holmes was teaching in 1919, you know, in the 1926 version of The Science of Mind, the 1938 version, and books that he subsequently wrote. So it's out there in a big way. It's out there. We had a therapist one time, an older man, come to Westlake to do a presentation on a Wednesday night. And he came to see me a couple of days before, and he said, I want to know more about your teaching. He said, could you give me maybe a book by Ernest Holmes that might be able to help me understand your teaching a little bit better? So I gave him Creative Mind and Success, which is, I have a first edition copy of that in my library. But I gave him one of the newer copies of it. And he came early the night he was to speak. And he had this book in his hand, and he was waving it at me like, this book, he said, this man was teaching in 1919 what I'm teaching in 2000, whatever year it was, 2014. He said, how can that be? How could I have missed out on this all these years? How did I not know about this man? And I said to him, just quite simply, his name was Soderquist. I said, Dr. Soderquist, I said, no wine before it's time. That because I didn't know what else to say to him. You know, why didn't I know about this? And I think that's the lament of many people who come late to this teaching is, why didn't I know about this sooner?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is that we need to do, except that I know in my heart of hearts that, as with the 12-step program, the Science of Mind is a philosophy of attraction rather than promotion. Like, people are attracted to what we are, and to know what it is that we have, and are willing to, as it says in 12-step, go to any lengths to get what we have. And if that means coming to a center for spiritual living, or a Church of Religious Science, some of them are still called that around the country, then that's the way it is. So if we go out into the world and we practice this teaching and our lives reflect this teaching in a way that people can appreciate, then that's what draws them to our centers.
Mm-hmm. What words of wisdom would you like to ensure are recorded as the legacy that you have to the world?
And it isn't just my legacy. I think it's the legacy of every practicing minister in this teaching. I'll name a few: Dr. Kathy Ann Lewis, Dr. David Alexander, Dr. David Leonard, Reverend Dr. Keith Cox, Reverend Mike McMorrow, one of my students who's a wonderful, wonderful minister, Dr. David Alt, also one of my students, a wonderful teacher. That each one of us brings a unique interpretation of the science of mind. You know, that quote by Dr. Bitzer, the infinite mind of God. Oh gosh, now that I said I was going to start it. How does he say it? The infinite mind of God presents to my consciousness whatever it is that I need to effect a healing for those people who have come to me and for those people who will come to me in my ministry. And I think what that is for each one of us to make a difference. You know, that the saying is, you know, that if I've affected the life of one person, then I've done my job. But I don't think many of us know to what extent in teaching the science of mind. And I say, you know what, it's not so much about teaching the science of mind, it's about teaching the creative process, or how to use the creative process effectively. And how we uniquely use that is through our unique interpretation of the science of mind. That each one of us is here, again, to make a difference in the life of one person or the life of 1,000 people. It makes no difference. So what I want people to know about me is that has been my vision and my mission for my ministry, and it continues after leaving the pulpit. That I am so pleased to be a part of this philosophy, because it has changed my life in miraculous and wonderful ways, and continues to do that.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Maureen Hoyt, for being with us today. And I'm sure that your message is going to be very uplifting to many people who watch this. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Marilyn. I appreciate it.
Hello, I'm Marilyn Leo, founder of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. I hope you have enjoyed this wonderful interview with this very special wise sage person. They've been around for quite a while. If you value these interviews, we invite you to show your generosity by making a donation or joining as a member of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. Thank you for watching.